welcome to the last section of the course. So this section actually is going to kind of combine two chapters. We're going to be looking at some information from chapter 17 and 18, and generally put together, they focus on overall drug prevention. So now that we've learned a lot about these individual classes of drugs, we're going to talk now about how they fit into society a little bit and what we can do to try and prevent some of the negative effects of these drugs upon people in society. So let's start off talking about chapter 17. So in this chapter, we're going to do a few things. We're going to first start off by talking about the goals and the outcomes generally of preventing drug use and just kind of define those in a little bit more clear terms. Then we're going to talk about some different approaches to preventing drugs. And there's a few we're going to go through here specifically. And we'll kind of end with here talking about prevention in schools and what's been done in the past. And out of all of this, what actually works to help prevent drug use in our communities and our society as a whole. All right. So let's talk first about some goals and outcomes. So generally, what is it that we are trying to do with this prevention? So when we talk about that, we look at generally ways of how do we prevent drug use and its associated harms. So with this, a lot of things we talk about are how drugs fit into our society. And when thinking about this, we sort of have some examples that we can rely on or tie references to about drugs that I guess you could say work in our society. And those are things like alcohol and nicotine and even caffeine, right? And these types of drugs typically tend to have small or few negative side effects or consequences to using them within society. And we tend to approach these from a different perspective as those that are more considered, illegal substances, things like that. So preventative efforts in these regards have been ways to which, we can kind of focus on teaching people how to exist with these drugs, how to use them in a healthy way, and reducing sort of that large dependence or use of them. And there has been some thoughts on doing this with drugs that are in the illegal category as well. And whether or not that would be good or bad to do is something that, there's been debate back and forth between. And we'll talk about some different approaches here as we go through this. So looking at these different approaches to drug use, there's a few different ones that we're going to talk about here. So first, we're going to talk about some traditional approaches, specifically those referred to as the public health model approaches. So this takes on a few different steps, if you will. Primarily, its approach here is to prevent drug use altogether. So its primary goal is prevention, right? And this aims typically at young people who have not even yet tried drugs and may sort of try and encourage them not to even begin using drugs in the first place. The downside to this is that oftentimes it may have the opposite effect, where instead of preventing people from trying drugs, it may sort of open their eyes to drugs that they haven't previously been aware of. And so that curiosity may actually lead them down the road of maybe even trying these drugs. Its secondary step here, or secondary approach, is prevention, right? So if we had the primary prevention, the secondary prevention here is aimed at people who have already tried drugs, maybe experimented with different drugs. And here the goal is to prevent them from trying more dangerous drugs, right? So maybe they've had some exposure to less dangerous drugs, and we want to prevent them from trying or engaging in those more dangerous types of drugs. So some examples here might be, colleges encouraging students to drink alcohol responsibly, not to, eliminate it altogether. And then lastly, what we have here is their tertiary prevention, or the third level of prevention, which would be aimed at people who have actually gone through the process of engaging in more dangerous or harmful drugs. And now the goal here is to try and treat that and, keep them off of those substances, prevent relapse and things like that. So sort of the three steps. Step one, primary, is to keep people from using drugs altogether. If they have tried drugs, then we try and keep them from trying the harder drugs. And then lastly, if they have done that, we look at ways to prevent future use and prevent things like relapse. Then we have the continuum of care model of prevention here. And this kind of takes on a few different steps as well. So looking at things like, universal prevention, where we're looking at generally how can we help everybody in a society. So some examples of where we see these types of care are in places like communities or schools or just larger areas that are trying to do good for the whole community. Then we have this idea of selective prevention, right, which is where we focus on specific subgroups of people that are more at risk, so high risk groups, and try and find ways to most benefit them in this area. So again, some examples here might be students that aren't generally doing well academically, poorer neighborhoods and communities, and things like that, where we can target those people to specifically try and assist in preventing drug use. And then lastly, we have the indicated prevention. And what this is basically is it targets individuals who show signs of developing problems. So some examples of this are things like adults who have been maybe arrested for driving under the influence, and we target them because they've already sort of shown signs that they may be a higher risk population. All right, so those are kind of two different approaches to how we might try and prevent drug use and how we might approach going at that. Let's talk next about some different programs that have been used specifically in schools, and break down some of the different techniques as well as what seemed to work well and what maybe doesn't work as well. All right, so the first one we have here is this knowledge, attitudes, behavior model. So you can think of this sort of as the idea of the classic like scare tactics, right? So in this model, it kind of centered around, people who have sort of authority, maybe police, former drug users, or even pharmacologists will come in and sort of tell students about the dangers and the harms of drugs. The idea to scare them straight, right? So to keep them from using these drugs by seeing all the dangers associated with them. Again, some assumptions of this approach is that students will sort of change their attitudes based on these perspectives that they're given. And that's not necessarily always the case. That's not always what happens. So it's found sort of generally that they're effective at increasing the knowledge about drugs, but they might be ineffective at altering the behaviors and the attitudes of drugs. So students might learn more about them, but it doesn't mean that they're going to change their perspective on them just from these sort of scare tactics that might be used. All right, and then we have this effective education preventative program. And what this is sort of this idea of focusing on the emotions and the attitudes of underlying drug use and trying to get people, or children in this case, to sort of morph or adapt those views in a way that will lead them to be less likely to actually engage in drug use. So some of the reasons, right, that students may even engage in different drugs might be for feeling of excitement, right, or relaxation, or feelings of power, or in just generally response to peer pressure. And so this approach here really kind of focuses on those feelings and those expressions in a way to try and alter those so students or children have less of an desire to kind of use drugs in the first place. And so this is done through a few different ways. So there's this values clarification that is sort of the first approach here, which basically makes the assumption that the ability to make appropriate decisions based on the drug information is lacking in drug using adolescents. So students aren't even really able to make appropriate decisions because of this sort of assumption that they have. So it assumes that students have sort of factual information about drugs, which may not necessarily be true. And it emphasizes that students should place, that we should be placed basically value on teaching these students more about decision making than just about sort of the harms of the drugs. It also prevents different alternatives to drugs here, right? So it's a way to kind of focus these emotional aspects on other outlets, right? So doing things that provide these natural highs, right? So things like sports or other social activities. And then, of course, there's some different personal and social skills that are tried to be taught and learned in this sort of approach, which again is this assumption, and we looked at this in some of the, I think one of the TED Talks talked about this a little bit, where we looked at sort of the reason people use drugs isn't for the drugs themselves, but in some response to some kind of social or personal failure, right? So there are other problems in their life that lead them to use these drugs. And so this approach really aims at trying to fix those problems rather than focusing as much on the drugs themselves. All right, the third approach we have here is the anti-drug norms. So the idea behind these is this idea of just say no, right? So here we have sort of this new approach, well, new from the 80s, that was all about sort of just teaching kids sort of the skills they needed sort of in the social settings to just say no and refuse drugs when being offered to them. So again, teaching students refusal skills, which was a new approach back then, and aiming on this sort of collective effort on this idea of drug-free schools, right? So just making it so that's sort of a general no, not allowed policy kind of thing. And again, these refusal skills focus on teaching students to recognize and respond to the peer pressure as well, and teaches them to say no to the offerings and the use of drugs. And so the last model we have here is the social influence model. And here again, it's kind of taking a lot of the ideas from the previous models and trying to combine them into one sort of overall approach. And so we look at different skills here that are kind of tied to these previous things that we've looked at in the other models, such as refusal skills, public commitment of basically having people or children in this case promise in front of peers and other friends and adults to not start smoking or not start doing other drugs, making a pledge not to do so. So that public commitment, again, helps to kind of add weight behind their decision to not use drugs. Then we have things like countering advertising. So a lot of advertising, right, looks at trying to get people into drugs, smoking, alcohol, things like that, and teaching kids how to understand these messages and also understand that the purpose of the advertising is to get you to use the product, right? And so you need to be kind of aware of that and be able to combat sort of those psychological trends, understanding that the ideas that you see in the ads, those positive things that might be shown, are not the reality of the drug. And so understanding those differences was kind of an important point in this, in teaching students this in this model. Also, we have things like normative education, right? So generally, students might overestimate how many of their peers did engage in these drug activities, things like smoking or other drugs. And here, the goal was to really present more factual information about smoking trends and reduce the attitude of, well, everybody's doing it, so it doesn't matter if I do, right? So showing that it's actually less common than they might have thought, and thus reducing that sort of general peer pressure to also engage in that activity. And then again, things like teen leaders was another idea here, where they had these sort of peer role models, right, that were engaging in good behaviors, not using drugs, and using that as a way to, again, emphasize better use or lack of. And then lastly, of course, we have the DARE program, right? The Drug Abuse Resistance Education, or DARE. So this came out in the early to mid 80s, and it really kind of spread around the 90s, right? So this was sort of the idea of trying to prevent students, early prevention specifically of students getting into drugs. And again, we're kind of going back to that earlier model where a lot of this information was delivered by trained police officers, sometimes not in uniform, but people that sort of had experience with the more dark side of drug use. So it uses elements from these other models, the social influence model, and kind of developed a little bit farther into this more commonly known of now, this idea of DARE. And again, there are some positives and maybe some not so positives of this. Using things like refusal skills, teen leaders, public commitment are all still things that were part of DARE. And However, some of the effectiveness of it wasn't entirely there, right? So there have been studies since that have shown that some of the effectiveness to DARE isn't necessarily as strong as we'd hoped it would be. And so looking at some of these studies, we see that oftentimes the exposure to new drugs from this DARE program, even just learning about them, sort of might have increased the capacity or increased students' willingness to even try that drug in the first place. So they may have had no idea it even existed until they learned about it in the DARE program, and that made them curious to go out and seek it and try it themselves, which was, of course, the opposite effect that DARE was going for. So again, some pros and cons trying to educate, but there often were some negative consequences of this approach as well. All right, so those were kind of the different approaches in schools and younger education. But let's talk now about what does work, what did work, what parts of those were positive and seem to be kind of beneficial, from a holistic perspective. So generally, some of the programs from the social influence model were positive. They did often draw some good outcomes in reducing drug use. And so when we look at those, we think about some of the, things like the life skills training, right? So teaching some of those resistance skills, the normative education, understanding media and advertising influence, I think are good components to get students or to get children to better understand kind of the psychological side of why this drug use might be a problem. Then we also saw some different peer programs that were beneficial, right? So the idea of having open discussion among groups of friends and peers and adolescents helped to kind of reduce that, again, everybody's doing it mindset and understand some of the negatives of it, and that it was okay not to engage in drug use and still be happy and seek those positive sort of reinforcements elsewhere. Then we had sort of the idea of family and parent groups, and these here talk about how sort of making a larger community of positive outcomes is good as well. So things like, teaching appropriate attitudes about drugs from the parent to the child, recognizing potential problems in children that parents are also aware of, but also teaching parents sort of the skills that they need to be able to identify these and also be able to kind of just be aware of what their children are doing and help them kind of, learn the ways to approach this in a healthy way. There were also things like parent support groups, which can be good, adjusting and teaching parents ways to help their children undergo sort of these drug prevention programs and things like that. And just general knowledge, I think, about how to help students or help children stay away from drugs using some of these methods we've just talked about. And then we have community programs as well. So we're taking a broader step here, even more. So not just within the home, but also within the larger community as a whole, looking at organizations or just generally programs that help at a community level reduce sort of this widespread drug use, right? So things like doing drug education, drug abuse prevention, things like that. Are going to help just from a larger community perspective. All right, then we have prevention in the workplace. So this is sort of looking at how also not just within the community, but also how your specific workplace can help with drug prevention. So in actually the late 80s, the federal government sort of did a thing where they required all organizations that receive federal funding to be drug-free workplaces. So any agency that received federal funding had to abide by that drug-free policy. And again, most of the ways that they went about doing this was by doing sort of random urine testing for drugs. And that was kind of the way they abided by this this rule, if you will. And so ultimately the goal here, right, was to prevent drug use by making it clear, not only through smaller social groups, but as a larger sort of policy, and that generally by providing information from that large scale that it's not condoned would hopefully prevent the use on a smaller scale as well. All right, so that covers chapter 17. Let's talk now real briefly about some information from chapter 18 that I wanted to point out. We're going to go less in depth in this chapter, but there were a few things I think that were valuable in discussing kind of when looking at sort of how to go about treating substance use disorders and just the general sort of larger overview of how this might be or how we might approach this. So we're going to start off by talking about treatment approaches. So look at how these different approaches were handled and what was unique about them. And then we'll talk also about some different strategies to enhance public health and safety. And so those are really the two main things I want to talk about from chapter 18, because I think they're kind of the most relevant and important to kind of understand here. All right, so for treatment approaches, there's a few different ones that we have here. So when we look at these approaches, they really kind of break down into two general categories, and those are the psychotherapeutic approaches, which are sort of the more psychological side of things. And then we also have, of course, the pharmacotherapies, which is really the medication side of things. And so looking at these two, if we start off with the psychotherapeutic approaches, we have kind of a few different things to kind of discuss within this approach. So looking at just that psychological side of things. First off, we want to kind of make sure we understand that there is this difference in sort of how we approach this, whether or not we're looking to ultimately get abstinence from drug use altogether or some level of controlled use. So are we trying to have people not engage, not use this drug at all? Or are we trying to or allow them to use it to some degree, but control the amount to which they're using it? So an example of this is sort of the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous. And again, one of the TED Talks I think went into this, where looking at this idea is where with Alcoholics Anonymous, they really believe that it is an all or nothing sort of thing, that it is a disease that they have and that they either need to if they don't abstain completely from engaging in alcohol, then they are going to slip back into negative tendencies. So this idea of abstinence would be, again, psychologically, you're unable to sort of use it in a healthy way. And so the only healthy approach for you is to not use it at all. On the other hand, a controlled use might be for those that, again, can use the substance in a controlled and healthy way, and it doesn't have negative side effects or negative consequences on their life. Looking at some motivational enhancement therapy. So this second bullet point there on that first section. So this is another way that we can sort of approach treatment from just a psychotherapeutic perspective. So again, the idea here is it is allowing or it's attempting to get people to shift their focus away from this denial of a drug problem and towards the motivation to change. So a lot of the times people who are in this sort of deep-rooted drug use pattern are going to deny that it's a problem in the first place. And so the goal of this motivational enhancement therapy is to just try and motivate them to say, hey, maybe this isn't great. Maybe there's something I need to do, some changes I need to make to get them started sort of down that path. The benefit here is that we want to try to just get someone started, and hopefully that's going to lead them to more positive outcomes, and they can look at some of these other approaches once they've sort of accomplished that first step. And so the next thing we have here is the contingency management, right? So this idea is that once we've sort of taken that first step, the idea now is to how do we manage our psychological perspective and approach to be able to stay within a healthy pattern, right? So it uses things like immediate rewards to obtain desired behaviors. So for example, maybe a person might be given a voucher that they can redeem for some good if that person provides a drug-free urine sample, right? So they demonstrated that they're not using drugs and they receive some immediate benefit of showing that, right? So again, the idea here is to keep people under this positive outcome, so keep them off drugs. And what can we do to achieve that? Again, using rewards and things like that is a good approach. And lastly, under this section, we also have cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. And again, this uses sort of the idea of this not only behavioral approach, but also adding in some cognitive components and principles to, again, use cognitive therapy techniques as well as behavioral skills training to accomplish more of a holistic approach from the psychotherapeutic perspective. And so one of the things we might be looking at here is sort of a blend between the psychotherapeutic and the pharmacotherapies, where we're looking at, again, this idea of how we can get people off drugs, not just psychologically, but also we might need to start incorporating some more cognitive and potentially physiological components as well. And so that really takes us nicely into the pharmacotherapies approach. And this is a little bit different, where the goal here is less about getting people to psychologically not want to or engage in drug use, but more about alleviating some of the physiological symptoms of drug use. So again, the goal is to relieve these withdrawal symptoms or these long-term negative symptoms and try to keep people off drugs, not only psychologically, but physiologically as well. And so some of the components of this are things like detox, right? Detoxification, we talk about the idea where that specific medications may be administered to reduce these strong negative side effects of coming off of drugs to help people undergo that process. So again, if stopping taking a drug results in these strong negative physiological symptoms, it's going to be really hard for people to stop engaging in that activity. And so using some pharmacotherapies and adding in other temporary solutions to reduce some of those physiological, challenges are going to help people in those first stages coming off of those more serious drugs. And so when it comes to maintenance here, there's really kind of three approaches or strategies that tend to be used from a pharmacotherapy approach, right? So from that medical side of things or medication side of things. And that is the agonist or substitution therapy, where a medication might be induced to sort of mimic the drug and provide some similar feelings where it's binding to those same receptors, but providing similar things without as much of the negative consequences. Then the second approach here might be an antagonist theory or therapy. And that is where, again, we have something blocking those receptors so the drug can't get in. So maybe, if you take this medication, then anytime you engage in your drug use, you're not going to have any of the positive side effects to that drug that you may have had in the past. And so without feeling those positive elements, you're going to have really no real motivation or reason to continue using the drug. And then lastly, the third approach here is the idea of punishment therapy, where by taking some kind of medication, it actually induces sort of negative consequences if you were to do that drug, right? So maybe now you get far more nauseous or far more sick from engaging in the drug that previously you wouldn't have otherwise felt those negative consequences. So three approaches here, again, maybe something to replace it, maybe something to block it out entirely, or maybe something to provide negative feelings when you use that drug. All right. And so lastly, we're going to kind of wrap up here looking at sort of this last section, where here we're going to focus on some strategies to enhance public health and safety overall. So one of the first things we're going to talk about here is the idea of drug legalization, right? So if we legalize drugs or legalize certain types of drugs, does this provide positive outcomes and positive benefits? And I think that there have been people who have suggested this is the case, right? That legalization will decrease some of the violence associated with the drug in terms of both selling and buying and trafficking and things like that. This is still an ongoing debate. I think that you can see this, has been discussed in a lot of different places. And, I think that there are certainly some potential pros to doing this. I think that there are potential cons as well. So it's hard to say one way or another whether this is the solution all widespread across the board. But I think that there are certainly some positives that could be said to this, but also some things we might want to be hesitant about in this regard. The next thing here that is sort of important from a public health and safety perspective is the idea of drug purity testing, right? So if we look at drug purity testing, this idea really kind of came about from, trying to keep what drugs people are using still as pure as they can be. So people at least know what they're ingesting, know what they're choosing to engage in, and aren't sort of potentially having those drugs mixed with potentially more dangerous drugs or substances as well. And so we've seen this been used in other countries, other places. It's shown generally positive outcomes, I think, looking at some of these. And again, this idea here really is just about trying to get people to know what they're ingesting and understand that the drug that they're choosing to engage in, whether good or bad, is at least pure in form and isn't being mixed or added to other more dangerous things. Another strategy here from the community perspective is this idea of heroin-assisted treatment, right? So the idea of this is where people who are addicted or have strong issues with heroin can actually get assistance in, again, using this or using heroin, using that substance. And while that might seem counterintuitive, there are some positives to this. It alleviates some of the negative outcomes of things that have been associated with heroin use that aren't a direct result of them. But things like, for example, needle sharing, HIV, and things like that might be worsened by this more street use of heroin, if you will. Whereas having more assistive treatment areas where people who really are so addicted they need to and will still continue to use this regardless of whether it is done in a safe or an unsafe manner, having them have assistive places to go and be able to actually engage in this activity in a safe way is another possible positive approach that has been discussed for community or societal level. And then lastly here, we have kind of along the same approach, the idea of safe drug consumption sites. So same idea here, really, that people who are going to consume these drugs, are going to engage in these activities, should be doing so at least in a safe manner and in a safe way. And so this helps not only with those people kind of having a safe space to engage in these activities without some of these negative consequences, like additional disease or additional issues, but also keeps that sort of off of the streets in general and keeps people who might not otherwise be exposed to it from being exposed and potentially getting involved in such activities. All right, and that really wraps up the last section here. So again, this last section here was really all about how we can go about preventing substance abuse in general and keeping people who maybe have issues with substance abuse from engaging in either that same abuse or more dangerous activities beyond that. So this really wraps up the last piece of the puzzle here. We've learned about all the different drugs and how they sort of fit into society. And now we've talked a little bit about how we can try and prevent people from kind of engaging in the more dangerous ones in general. So with this information, I hope you can kind of take this, use it to help with your final project and kind of get that all kind of tied in together and wrap things up and end the semester strong. So I wish you guys good luck. Please let me know if you have questions. And again, I hope you guys had a great semester.